You're tuned into Holy Smokes, Cigars, Catholicism, and Conversation. Let my prayer arise in thy sight as incense. I'm your host, Dustin Quick, and this is episode 57. Before I introduce my very special guest, who's sitting very close to me, much closer than he normally would, or any of my guests would for that matter, I just want to let everybody know after this airplane passes.
Yeah. Welcome to Fort Myers.
That Havana Palace on Huron Church Road in Windsor, Ontario, Canada, is the official sponsor of the Holy Smokes podcast. So if you would be so kind to give them a like, so go to their Facebook page at facebook.com/Havana Palace. Family owned and operated, great prices, fine cigars, and you won't find a better outfit than Havana Palace. So give them a like. They and I would greatly appreciate it. All right, guys. So we have a very special episode for you today. Not only am I on location in Fort Myers at the home of Dr. Jim Papandrea, which I'm very honored and blessed to be doing this, we're going to do a Q&A today. So we're going to focus on the medieval to some extent, but mostly the early church. So if you guys have any questions and you're watching and you want to put them in the comment box, go right ahead and make sure you share this episode to any of your friends and family. And we got somebody who just checked in here, so that's great. Any questions, please feel free on the early church. You have the expert here, Jim. He's going to field those questions. But before we get into the live questions, I actually have some pre-prepared that were sent in to me by viewers and subscribers. So we're going to tackle some of those first, okay? All right, so the first question I have from my friend Edwin is, do you think the schism of 451 and the subsequent fights between the Egyptian Syrian churches and the Roman Church and its subsequent wars and fights opened the door and allowed Islam and its control and eventual overthrow of Christianity in those areas? So what do you think, Jim?
Yeah, so that is a huge question. And, we may end up talking more about this whole aftermath of after the Council of 451, after Chalcedon. It's a mess. It's a complete mess. And part of the reason why it's a complete mess is because the emperors in Constantinople were trying so hard to reconcile everyone after 451 that some of them were willing to accept some heresies or go down some questionable roads. So now to the question, the short answer is yes, because there's a couple things going on here. One of which is that the wars create distance between certain factions and Constantinople. And so what ends up happening is when I want to say Arab forces come in and start conquering the different areas, and there's a sort of a motivation there for them to favor anyone who's not in good standing with Constantinople. So anyone who is on the outs with the emperor is going to be treated better by the colonizers, let's say. And now, there's a myth out there that some of the non-Chalcedonian Christians welcomed the Arabs as liberators, and that's not really true. I would not go that far. But once you have, these wars, and once you have the separation that takes place from Constantinople, well, then that just opens the door for either these non-Chalcedonian versions of Christianity to flourish in non-Byzantine lands, or for Islam to take over, and the Christians in those areas, or we're calling the non-Chalcedonians Christians anyway, but they didn't have the support from the empire, and so it's a huge mess, and the controversies over Christology and the colonizing of the Arab forces created a perfect storm, which prevented reconciliation after 451.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now I see we've got some questions in the chat, guys. We will get to those as soon as I go through the few that are pre-prepared. So just give us a moment here.
Tom says, "Don't forget the sunscreen." Thanks, Tom.
Yes.
Yeah,
thanks,
it's
Tom.
sorry about the shadows. We're doing our best to
kind of squinting
ride
a little
with the
bit,
sun here, but
yeah, we're doing our best. So we appreciate your guys' patience. Okay. Now, here's one about the saints. Some historians say Christianity traded polytheism for saintism, quote unquote. That what the lesser gods used to do, the saints are now looked to for intercession. For example, to have a baby, to grant travel protection, etc. Would you say this is in some way accurate or really off from what the evidence shows?
well, I think the evidence from the early church would say that this really did not happen. It sounds like the question kind of combines history with maybe what's happening now. In other words, are there people now or in recent centuries who have maybe taken the idea of patron saints too far and sort of in their minds give too much power to these dead humans? Yeah, that does happen. But in the early church, it really doesn't happen. The evidence shows that the early Christians would be horrified to think that they were attributing the same kind of powers or whatever to the saints. A lot of times this myth is combined with another myth that says that the early church sort of took over pagan holidays and baptized them and made them into, and that's also a myth that didn't happen. Obviously, those of you who are watching this, it sounds like you guys have studied this stuff maybe more than the average viewer, so you probably know this, but there was a huge controversy in the early church over how to calculate the date for Easter. So you'll hear this myth that, Easter was originally a pagan holiday and it was borrowed. That can't be true. It couldn't possibly be true because the Christians had their own controversy over Easter and how to figure out the date for Easter that had nothing to do with pagan holidays. Same with Christmas. I mean, in the West, we celebrate Christmas on December 25th. That's just 9 months after the Annunciation. Jesus is conceived at the Annunciation, March 25th, add 9 months, December 25th. That's how you get Christmas. It has nothing to do with pagan holidays. So this myth about the early church sort of borrowing this stuff from paganism, yeah, that didn't really happen. Now, I'll qualify that a little bit, though, because after Christianity is legalized, and then Constantine goes in and creates his city, New Rome, and then eventually by the end of the 4th century, you have Christianity becoming the official religion of the Roman Empire, and you have these edicts from the emperors in the late 4th century that paganism has to be outlawed. So now we start to get occasions where instead of tearing down a pagan temple, they'll just rededicate it and make it a church, right? So that does happen. And sometimes they didn't really bother to change the name. So every once in a while you get this, temple to the Greek god Asclepius, god of healing, that might become, the Church of Saint Asclepius. Yeah, that does happen sometimes, but that's a little bit later in the church's history, and yet still, the actual saints, there was a lot of discussion around this, and it was pretty clear that the veneration and the reverence applied to the saints was a completely different thing from the kind of worship that the pagan gods would receive. We do, of course, have this concept of patron saints, and so there is a sense in which our saints are thought to be able to pray for us, and so because of that, if a saint was martyred in a certain way or had something about them, they become the patron of people with those same issues or whatever. And so you might ask that saint to pray for you if you find yourself having some sort of affinity with that saint.
Right.
And yeah, some people today take it a little too far, but we're really not supposed to ascribe any sort of divine power to these saints. They're not the ones who help us.
Right.
We're only asking them to pray for us. God is the one who helps us.
Yeah, and also it's worth mentioning too that everything good, true, and beautiful about quote unquote paganism is fulfilled in Christ's one true church. So while people may have been reaching in the darkness for lesser divinities to do this, that, and the third, we find this perfected in the prayers and the lives of the saints. So it's not a complete cutting off of what is natural to humanity, but we find it's purified, it's baptized, and ultimately deified in the Catholic Church as well.
Well, that's a good point. I mean, every human culture has religion, right? I mean,
Right.
you can see that there is deep within the psyche of our human nature this longing for contact and union with the divine, right? But left to our own devices, we're going to end up with paganism if we have to figure it out for ourselves. So it takes revelation. It takes God reaching out to us first through the Hebrew religion, and then through the incarnation of Jesus Christ. God reaches out to us, and over time clarifies how we are to relate to the divine. So yeah, do people make mistakes? Do people major on the minors? Sometimes, yeah, they do. But if you look at what the church officially teaches, you see this beautiful progression of ongoing clarification.
Right.
Yeah.
Great answer. Okay, guys, like I said, we will get to your live questions. We just got a couple more here. Okay, so this one's kind of long, but I think it's a good question. So, in the modern world of the search for a faith tradition that is pure and authentic and historically traceable through the historical critical method, secularists and Islamists, this person says, love to pounce on the Bible on various levels for not being original, having been tampered with in the manuscripts, etc., to the point where they say, how can it be the Word of God, being that it has errors? And Christians in particular, Catholics and Orthodox, in the tradition, it says, well, we do not just rely on the text, we rely on tradition, liturgically and ritually, to promote church teaching and doctrine. But the follow-up critique would be that that one would only have to look at each tradition's liturgy to see that there are different ways that liturgies are being done. And this shows that it's not consistent in the details. For example, unleavened versus leavened bread, facing east versus facing the people, standing versus sitting, etc. So how can it be from God if they're not doing it all the same? So a Muslim might say, look, all Muslims pray the same way, recite the Quran the same way, etc. So how would you answer this one?
Yeah, that's a long question. So here's my thoughts on that. First of all, I would question the premise of the question. In other words, that whole question is sort of based on the premise that somehow something is more of God if it asks the same thing of everyone, if it's the same for everyone. I'm not sure that's true. In other words, I think it's entirely possible that something can be of God and yet allow that different people can have sort of different elements to their relationship with God. Now, Christianity is, I think, and I hate to say it this way, I don't know how else to say it. Christianity is an essentially democratic religion. What I mean by that is Christianity has always sort of embraced the idea of free will. And so we are allowed to make make translations of the Bible. Now, first, let me say, we haven't really lost anything in translation. I mean, the New Testament documents are, in fact, the most reliable documents in all the ancient world in terms of the manuscripts.
Right.
But we live in a world where anyone can make their own translation of the Bible. And yeah, there are some bad translations of the Bible out there, or at least some that, aren't real translations, but are like paraphrased versions, and they're not that good. Islam, there is an authorized version, and nobody else gets to make this is how I understand it, nobody else gets to make, and I respect that, but, Christianity is more open in the sense of, allowing for, anyone to read the Greek and make their own translation. Now, you have to do that in the context of checks and balances. St. Peter says, no prophecy is a matter of one's own interpretation. So you don't get to do that in a vacuum or on your own. But the Christian faith has nothing to lose. I mean, we're not afraid of questioning. We can be open to inspection, and that's not going to hurt us. So, but I will say this: with regard to doctrine, Christianity has boundaries, right?
Right.
So there's room for some diversity within those boundaries, but there are serious boundaries. With regard to liturgical practices, the boundaries are a little bit wider. So there's more room for diversity of practice than there is for diversity of thought or doctrine. And I think that's actually a good thing. And so different cultures can adapt the devotion of Christianity to, their liturgical practices, but you don't get to change the doctrine just because you're from a different culture.
Yeah,
right?
The essential doesn't change.
Right.
Whereas accidental might change based on culture or whatever.
Right, and that's a great way to say it. In that if we're going to use those philosophical categories, right? Doctrine or dogma is the substance of the faith. The liturgical rubrics are accidental to that, and
right.
That's a good point. So it doesn't bother me that we have this kind of diversity, because where it counts, we have boundaries, and we know what those boundaries are. Yeah.
Amen.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's go to the next one.
Cheers. I hope you all out there are having a glass of wine with us.
Yes. Cheers.
Salud. Salud. Yeah, we get to do this, right?
Yeah. Good old time, folks. Good old time. Okay, so this one's maybe a bit simpler, but I know a lot of people do wonder about this, and the Catholic Church is often accused of changing the Sabbath day. So, did the Church, and this is actually my wife's question, by the way.
Okay.
So, thanks, hon. Did the Church change the Sabbath from Saturday to Sunday? Why or why not?
Okay, so this is interesting. From the beginning of the Church, Christian worship was centered on Sunday as the day of the Lord, right? And when you read the Church Fathers, they'll talk about how this is the day that Jesus was resurrected. But they didn't call it the Sabbath.
Right.
The Sabbath, when the Church Fathers refer to the Sabbath, they still mean Saturday.
Right.
After Christianity is legalized and the Emperor Constantine starts making laws that favor Christianity, one of the things he does eventually is to make Sunday a day of rest. In other words, no work on Sundays, so that Christians can worship. And I say this to my students, and I'm only somewhat kidding. I'm kind of half telling the truth. Constantine invented the weekend. Okay.
Thanks, Emperor
Constantine. Yeah, right. So yeah, I mean, I think it's at that point that after the 4th century that people start talking about Sunday as the Christian Sabbath.
Mm.
The other thing that happens in the 4th and 5th centuries is you've got, especially in the East, you've got places where believers are going to the synagogue on Saturday and church on Sunday. And for reasons that we don't need to go into, there are guys like John Chrysostom and others who are critiquing that. They're saying, no, you got to choose. If you're a Christian, you're a Christian. And even if you're ethnically Jewish, you have to stop going to the synagogue. And so I think as a part of that sort of movement to discourage Christians from continuing to practice the Jewish faith in addition to Christianity, I think that's when you start to get this idea that that Sunday is the new Sabbath. Now, there's some unfortunate aspects to this too, because you also get this theology that the church is the new Israel and the new chosen people, and so you do have certain church fathers planting the seeds of what will later be anti-Semitism, and this whole sort of idea that the church replaces Judaism, I think, is unfortunate, and what we need to see is more of the continuation of it.
The fulfillment.
Yeah, right, exactly. But at any rate, that's, I think, where that happens is after Christianity is legalized and then becomes the official religion of the empire. That's when you start to get that.
Okay. All right. Now, this might be in the... I'm going to read this first and then see if it's duplicated in the comments there. But this is from Devin. How do Catholics explain the Fifth Council's suspension of Pope Vigilius from office for supposed heresy in light of the condemnation of conciliarism as heresy in the Catholic Church? It's a heavy one.
Yeah, so now we're back to that whole aftermath after the Council of Chalcedon. Again, it's such a mess. Now, we're getting a little late for my area of expertise, so let me give that disclaimer. But I am not aware of anything in the Council of 553 where Vigilius himself is, considered a heretic or anything like that. As far as I know, what happens is this. Vigilius goes to the east, and so he's not in Rome. And while he's there, he's reluctant to endorse the council. And because of that, the emperor basically holds him under house arrest and doesn't let him go back to Rome until he finally issues a letter that says, okay, I endorse the council. And then they let him go back to Rome, but he never got there. He died that same year. So I think, the issue here is a couple of things. First of all, Origen. Origen's a heretic. Let's just get that right out on their table. Origen is a heretic. But there was questions about that, and there were questions over to what extent should followers or disciples of Origen be considered heretics. And there were disciples of Origen who were condemned by some of these councils, going back and forth. This is a controversy known as the Three Chapters, and I don't want to get into it. But the point is that when the emperors in Constantinople are trying to bring reconciliation between the Chalcedonians and the non-Chalcedonians, one of the things they're doing is they're trying to figure out who to throw under the bus so that they can get the non-Chalcedonians on board. And they sort of go back and forth on this, and I think this is what Vigilius was uncomfortable with. But the bottom line is, in trying to effect this reconciliation, the emperors themselves slip into heresy, either the Monophysite heresy or the Monothelite heresy, if those mean anything to you. And I mean, sometimes people look at Honorius or Vigilius, and they're trying to find heresy in Rome. And look, folks, you're not going to find heresy in Rome. Corruption? Yes, you will find corruption in Rome, and Vigilius himself was probably elected pope under sketchy pretenses, and so I'm not saying he was a saint, but I don't think he was a heretic. I don't think Honorius was a heretic. I think these guys were just not great theologians who didn't quite understand the implications of all that was going on, maybe even didn't quite understand the writings that they were supposed to respond to, especially Honorius. And so it was, the whole thing's unfortunate. But I mean, look, if you're looking to find heresy in Rome, well, you're going to find a lot more of it in Constantinople, because even though you may have these couple of popes who were not clear about some of these issues, the emperors and the patriarchs in Constantinople were full-on heretics for a good chunk of this time.
Yeah.
So, in comparison, I'm gonna give the popes the benefit of the doubt at this point. So.
Yeah, and I mean it's interesting because when you look at all the Christological heresies in the first millennium, they all started in the East, and Rome was looked to as the beacon of light in the darkness.
Yeah, and I think for good reason. And again, I mean, I'm not saying that all the popes were perfect. We have some very corrupt popes,
of course,
in the Middle Ages, in the Renaissance era, but even they didn't promote heresy, right? And so, there's a lot to that story, but I don't think you're going to find any reason to call a bishop of Rome a heretic doctrinally,
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
And that was for Devin. So Devin, I hope that
it's a great question. Devin, I love that you know this much about it to ask that question. Good for you.
All right. So here's one kind of outside of our scope, but I thought I'd let you take a crack at it if you wanted. You don't have to. How does Dr. Papandrea think St. Pope Pius V would respond to the liturgical reforms of the last 50 years?
Pius V. Okay, Council of Trent, right? So would the Pope at the Council of Trent be on board with Vatican II? Is that essentially the question? I mean, because here's the thing, right? So Vatican II, in case you can't tell, I myself am over 50 years old. I was actually born just as Vatican II was starting, or thereabouts. So in my lifetime, I mean, I've never had the opportunity to be a pre-Vatican II Catholic. I mean, my whole life has been post-Vatican II. But here's the thing. Any major council like that takes a lifetime to be implemented and for the implications of it to really settle in. After Vatican II, there were a lot of people on what I would consider the lefterly side of the church, right, who got all excited and started writing books about the spirit of Vatican II and how they thought Vatican II said things that it never said or did things that it never did. And so there was kind of this movement that went too far. And so when people look at guys like Pope John Paul II, Pope Benedict, and say, oh, they're so conservative. These guys were at Vatican II, right? So they know what Vatican II was really all about. And they were the ones correcting what had gone too far after Vatican II. So I think, well, I don't want to try and, get inside the head of Pius V. I mean, but I think that, on those aspects where people took Vatican II and ran with it and went too far with it, yeah, Pius would be like, but, now we're correcting that, I think, and we're finding our middle way. And we had John Paul II and we had Benedict, and now we have Francis, who, admittedly is maybe, at another place on the not theological spectrum, but on this whole spectrum. But, this is the history of the church. The history of the church is this pendulum that swings and is always looking to find that center of gravity in the middle of the extremes. And so that's the journey we're on as a church. And I'm okay with that. I don't know what Pius V will say. I expect to have lunch with him when I get to heaven, though.
God willing. Yeah. You know what? I have to say, if we mean Vatican II in terms of reforming the liturgy, would St. Pius V be upset? Well, all we have to do is look at Trent itself. Trent, how many Western liturgies did it squash in order to get a standardized Western liturgy?
Yeah, right.
So if all of these other particular Western churches were at the council and said, they might have been upset and said, where did our Ceremus go? Where did our, these would have all disappeared. And the Pope has every right to do this. In the encyclical, I think at Mediator Dei, it says that the Pope has authority and jurisdiction to not change the substance of the liturgy, but what is accidental to it. He can make modifications or outlaw or whatever the case may be, which is happening right now with Pope Francis and Traditionis Custodes. But this is nothing new in church history, and I think people sometimes might forget that.
Well, that's a good point. I mean, unless you want to argue that Pius V thought Trent should be the last council ever, right? And I don't think he said that. He would have to recognize that there would be future councils and that there would be, this sort of development over time. But I mean, who knows? Yeah.
Okay, let's see if we got any more written questions here. I think we got to the end of them. We did. So we can take some. We could take some from the comments. I just had to scoot up so I can see.
Yeah, we got the computer, the laptop a little farther away so we can both get in here.
That's right. We gotta see what we're looking at here. All right, let me let's see here. So Catholics are familiar with the Eastern Orthodox churches split, but lamentably not so much with the pre-Chalcedonian Oriental Orthodox churches. What say you?
It's funny that you say that, because I was actually just in one of my books today, and I've got the whole Nicene Fathers series, right? And I was looking at the one with the canons of the ecumenical councils, and the whole title of that volume is, something to the effect of the canons of the councils, the canons of the 7 councils when the church was one. I was like, excuse me, what? The church was only one for 3 councils, right? So to your point, I mean, people don't know about Chalcedon. When I do some speaking at ecumenical events, and of course, as you all probably know, I mean, the non-Chalcedonian Christians are considered Christians now. I mean, we have some measure of reconciliation with them. So when I go speak at these ecumenical events, and I have to talk about the ecumenical councils that apply to all Christians, well, there's only 3 of them. It's only the first 3. And so so that is kind of sad that we only have 3 councils that we can all agree on. But on the other hand, we have to acknowledge that, and we can't write off the Oriental Orthodox or even the Assyrians. The Assyrians are going to argue with me and say they don't like Ephesus, but okay, yeah, that's another story. But
Okay, let me have a bit of trouble. Now, can you scroll up? Are you able to scroll up here?
Yeah, you just do 2 fingers like that.
2 fingers.
Yeah.
And I have a Mac. For some reason, I forgot that.
They keep changing. I hate
All right.
technology.
Let's
All right,
see.
so where are we at?
All right, so let's do Devin here. Did the Eastern churches believe in papal infallibility and supremacy at the ecumenical councils and throughout the first millennium? That's a good question.
Okay. Well, papal infallibility is a tricky question, because when you say it that way, it sounds like we're saying the infallibility of the Pope, right?
Right.
And we really aren't saying that. I mean, even later, when this whole thing's become sort of codified into the possibility of an ex cathedra pronouncement and all that, we're not really talking about the infallibility of the Pope as a person. I always tell my students, if Pope Francis went to the, I don't know, some carnival, and they had a jar of jelly beans, and they said, guess how many jelly beans are in the jar? He could be wrong. Right?
Right.
So it's not the infallibility of the person, it's the infallibility of the office, by which we mean that the person in the office is prevented by the promise of Jesus, Matthew, the gates of hell will not prevail against the church, prevented from taking the church off the rails and for making the church become something it isn't, which like I was saying about even the most corrupt popes in the Renaissance era or whatever, they never took the church and made it into something that's not the church.
Right.
They never did that because God is preventing them from doing that. So the promise of Jesus in Matthew 16 is that the church will never become something that's not the church. And so I think in that sense, yes, in the first millennium, there is this sense that the church is sort of protected in this way. And as we see the development of the office of the Bishop of Rome as the papacy, to whatever extent people give authority to that office, they would also give it this kind of the faith in that office as the promise. But I always say authority is in the eye of the beholder, and so you can find people in the first millennium who don't want to give that kind of authority to the Bishop of Rome. But in general, as a consensus, you do see the church fathers say, yeah, we need to agree with Rome on matters of doctrine because of apostolic succession, and the bishops of Rome are the successor of Peter.
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting because if you look at, for example, stuff very early, like statement of St. Irenaeus of Lyon, where he says all the churches must agree with her, meaning the Church of Rome, all churches throughout the world. You have Pope St. Victor I, who believes himself, and this is in the 100s, he believes himself to have the authority to excommunicate the entire East over the dating of Easter.
That's right. Thankfully, he didn't do it.
Right.
Clement of Rome writes to the Corinthians with, this assumption that he has the authority to do so. He has the authority to tell them what to do, and that his writing is inspired by God, by the Holy Spirit. So, he basically says, you need to receive what I'm writing as though it were coming from Peter himself.
Right. And you had, for example, the formula of Hermistas, which ended the Acacian Schism. And if you look at the wording in there, it specifically identifies being in communion with the Catholic Church as being in communion with the Apostolic See. And the formula of Hermistas is very, very early. If you read the Acts of the Ecumenical Councils, many people don't know this, but if you read Chalcedon, if you read Ephesus, you will see that Rome is upheld as the teacher and mother of all Christians. You find this kind of language. You find it in 2 Nicaea as well with Pope Hadrian.
Oh, it's at the Council of Constantinople, I think, when they elevate Constantinople to the second place after Rome. I mean, that's the assumption. And you even see it in the edicts of emperors. You've got the Edict of Thessaloniki in was it 380, making Christianity the official religion of the empire, and it says, what is the faith that is the official religion of the empire? It is the faith that Peter delivered to the Romans.
Right.
Now, to be fair, they do mention Alexandria in there as well, but you get the idea, and so.
Yeah, and I mean, papal infallibility. It's really the one object of infallibility in the Catholic religion is the Catholic faith, but there are different organs that are used to manifest what that faith is. Ordinarily, it's the bishop in his diocese, or let's even see the pastor in his church. Then it's the bishop in his diocese. Sometimes it's regional synods. Sometimes it's ecumenical councils, which is all the more rare. And at the very top, at the most rare form, you have ex cathedra statements, but it's the same thing being proclaimed, which is the infallible faith of the church being taught by different organs at different levels.
Yeah, that's right. And of course, the whole idea of an ex cathedra pronouncement is relatively new in the grand scheme of things. But really, that was only meant to sort of clarify what the church already believed.
Exactly. So we got another question here.
Let's
go. How did the early church function, and how was it unified before it agreed to a New Testament canon?
Oh, yeah.
This is right up your alley, Jim.
Yeah, well, I mean, basically, I mentioned apostolic succession. That was the original seat of authority, right? So the idea that the apostles, the guys who knew Jesus personally, right, they held the authority over correct doctrine and all this stuff. And so naturally, even after they're gone, their disciples learned from them. And so I tell my students, it's like Kung Fu, right? It's like, there's a Kung Fu master who has these disciples, and then they open their own schools and they have their disciples. Right. And you can't just rent out a storefront and paint the window and says, I teach Kung Fu, if you didn't learn it from somebody else, right? I mean, you could, it's free country, but don't. And so this idea of this model of master and disciple is kind of an apprenticeship model. That is how the church was structured. And of course, if your apprenticeship, if you can trace your apprenticeship back to an apostle, that gives you more credibility, more authority than someone who can't. And if you can trace your authority back to the leader of the apostles, Peter, well, that's called the Bishop of Rome, right? And so it's all based on that. Now, the question mentions like before the church had a New Testament. Of course, there's a whole story which we don't have time to get into about the development of the New Testament. But of course, the church has the New Testament documents from very early on. And but it's interesting because who got to decide which writings from the first century would make it into the Bible, would become the New Testament? Well, it was exactly these people who were in succession from the apostles, the early bishops.
All right, let's. Can you scroll us down a bit there?
Yeah. So what do we got here? Let me see if I can. Me and technology don't get along. Tell me when to stop.
This one might be a new one here. The history of early Christianity revolves.
This one?
Let's check that one out.
The history of the early church revolves around a series of reaction to orthodoxy and a corresponding series of overreactions.
So those reactions to orthodoxy, hence the important creed.
Yeah. Well, I always teach my students that the history of the church is like a pendulum, and you will get people going to extremes, and then you will get someone else overreacting against that, going to the other extreme. And the whole history of the church is the attempt to find that center of balance. If you think of a pendulum swinging, the center of gravity is that place in the middle, a place of balance. So, for example, at the beginning you've got these Judaizers. We can see them already in the New Testament. They're advocating a kind of Christianity where Christians are supposed to follow the whole Jewish law, and presumably then they are denying the divinity of Christ. And then the pendulum swings to the other side, and you've got these guys who are denying the humanity of Christ.
Right.
And the church wants to be in this place of balance in the middle, where Christ is both divine and human. It's not an either or answer, And the church, the history of the church is full of people who want to try and simplify things by coming up with the either or answer.
Mm-hmm.
But orthodoxy is always that place of balance in the middle that is the both and answer. And yes, so the creed then becomes the church's authoritative statement about how to find that place of balance.
Okay.
Yeah.
We got one here from Devin. Let me see.
Devin, I'm underage. I'm making coffee. Good for you, Devin. We don't want to promote.
He's underage and he knows this much. How is Saint Cyprian a saint? Is as if I've heard he died in schism from Pope Saint Stephen in the See of Rome.
Well, I don't think he died in schism. I don't think I would go that far. He definitely was on the wrong side of the controversy with Stephen. And I've got a whole video on, rebaptism and all that. And Cyprian was on the wrong side of that debate for a while, but I think he eventually gets on board. So as I remember it, Stephen dies. Cyprian, was in good standing with Rome by the end of his life. And so, but this you make a good point. I mean, just because someone is a saint does not mean that everything they said or wrote is correct. I mean, Augustine wrote some things that the church rejected. Aquinas wrote some things that the church has since rejected.
Yeah.
And so, saints aren't infallible. They're not. So Cyprian is a saint partly because he was a great bishop, but he's got his flaws. I mean, he ran from the persecution and he had to spend a lot of time justifying that. But at the end of the day, he was a martyr. And so that's really why he's a saint.
And look at Peter. He denied our Lord. He was called Satan, and yet he was crucified upside down.
That's right. Yeah. So if Peter and Paul, can be reconciled to the church after, what they went through, I mean, there's hope for any of us, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, what do you think are some of the biggest misconceptions about the early church? What about worship? Because that's a big one. Everyone talks about wanting to have the Book of Acts church. They want to do church like the early church, and they're kind of trying to reinvent the wheel or start from scratch. And they have these preconceived notions about what worship was and wasn't like.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
So here's what I think. If you say, I want my church to be like what they were doing in the Book of Acts, that's a little bit like saying, I want my airplane to be like the first prototypes that the Wright brothers ever built, right? Except those prototypes didn't fly, folks, right? So what you see in the Book of Acts is a lot of trial and error, a lot of experimentation. I mean, I don't fault them. These are our apostles, right? So that's fine. But they were still figuring things out. I mean, look at baptism. Baptism and confirmation and the baptism with the Holy Spirit doesn't happen the same twice. Worship. Okay, so at one point, Paul preaches until after midnight and then celebrates the Eucharist. But then the poor guy falls out the window because he falls asleep. So I don't think that you can find anything in the Book of Acts that will help you recreate early Christian worship or liturgy. I really think the earliest thing you can look at is Justin Martyr's First Apology, where towards the end he talks about, here's what we do in our worship. But even then, he's writing that for pagans. So you can't treat it like it's a rubric,
Right.
But on the other hand, it's got pretty much everything in there. So, it's pretty interesting.
How would you like when I read that treatise from Justin Martyr, I thought, wow, basically all of the elements that are in the Mass today are found in that treatise.
Yeah,
which is
I know.
phenomenal because that's in the 100s.
That's right. He's writing it about 150. But did you notice there's no mention of singing in there? Now we know that they did sing though because that's mentioned in other documents. So he's not creating for us a precise order of worship.
Right.
But it is amazing how only a century or so after the beginning of the church, here we have a description of liturgy that looks almost exactly like what you would say Catholic or Orthodox worship looks like today. But to try to go any farther back than that, there just isn't enough information. There just isn't. But I can tell you this. We do know, you're probably aware of this, we do know that the Eucharist starts out as a part of a meal in imitation of the Last Supper. Very quickly, though, the Eucharist, the sacrifice of the Mass, the Eucharist, becomes separated from the meal for various reasons. Partly because the emperors were making laws against the secret society meetings. Partly because of abuse. Look at 1 Corinthians 11, where the Corinthian Christians are treating it like a pagan banquet, right? So very quickly it becomes separate and it gets moved to the morning. So but you do you probably have the sense that it starts out as a part of this agape meal.
Yeah.
But again, even that we can't really recreate that because the meal, very quickly it becomes recognized that the meal itself gets in the way of the sacrament.
Right.
And so the sacrament has to be separate from the meal. I thought there was something else I was going to say, but I lost it.
Well, I mean, even from what we can garner from the New Testament, from the earliest times, the thing that I think hone in on is the fact that it was worship was Eucharist centered.
Yeah, of course. Oh, that's the other thing I was going to say, right? Because the whole thing is based on the Jewish ritual home meals, right? Not what was going on in the synagogue, but what was going on in the home, the Sabbath meal, the Passover meal. The whole thing is based on that, theologically sort of undergirded with concepts from temple worship, sacrifice, yeah. Right? Right. And so about this. And so it's this very interesting sort of combination of Jewish temple worship and Jewish home meal worship that becomes the earliest Christian worship and liturgy. So, look at those things and if you want to, see what early Christian worship was about. But beyond that, it's tough. I mean, Tertullian has some things where he's describing, but we don't know how much he's talking about a more charismatic meeting as opposed to liturgy. It's not totally clear.
Right, because of his Montanist leanings.
Yeah.
But and that's the thing. Well, okay, it's Eucharist centered, but the Eucharist was not simply a mental assent to a type of memory of an event either.
Right. Oh yeah. Well, this is where the sort of the temple worship comes into play because and Passover. I mean,
yeah.
Passover was a ritual reenactment of the original Passover. And the Eucharist is a ritual reenactment of the Passion of Christ. Not, again, to your point, not simply as a memorial, but as a way of making it real and making it present and all of that. Yeah.
Well, guys, I don't see any more questions. We are coming up, let's check the time. We're coming up on an hour. So if there aren't any more questions, I think we can probably wrap it up here. I greatly appreciate, Jim, you inviting me into your lovely home and spending this time with me. And we just got another. Why don't we? I thought that was another one. It was the one on St. Cyprian.
Oh, that's Cyprian. Did we? Let's see if we missed any.
Let's see if we missed any before.
All right. Let's see. We're looking at the chat here.
I think I found one. We found one from Devin.
A filioque question.
Hey, there you go.
Oh boy, here we go. The Latin Church believed in a hypostatic filioque in the first millennium. It seems though Maximus and deny this. Well, Maximus. Okay, so I'm not. Do you get what he means by a hypostatic filioque?
I don't, but I do know that Maximus's formulation. He didn't say there was anything wrong with the Latin theology of the filioque.
He supported it. Maximus
So-
supports the filioque, but here's the thing, and I have a whole video on the filioque too. There's really two filioques, right? I mean, and so when you're in, and for those of you who might not be familiar with this, filioque is the Latin word that we translate into English as and the Son. So when we say in the Creed that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son, the question is, well, wait a minute, is that true? Because those three words, those three English words, one Latin word, were not in the original version of the Creed, right? And so the question becomes, well, is that true? All right. Well, here's the tricky part. There are two ways to understand the filioque, and this may be what he's referring to as the hypostatic filioque. But so one way to understand the filioque is, is the Son involved in the procession of the Spirit as the Spirit's very existence and internal relationship with the Father?
Not just economic.
Right.
Yeah.
The second way of understanding it is the Son involved in the procession of the Spirit to humanity and to the church? So one is internal to the Trinity, one is external to the Trinity. And did the Latin Church believe in So here's the thing. Augustine did say that he believed in both. But today we need to pull Augustine back a little bit, and we need to say, okay, really, the relationship between the Spirit and the Father is a direct relationship, and the Spirit's very existence is dependent only on the Father, not on the Son. But with regard to the Spirit as a gift to humanity and to the church, then yes, the Son, the Spirit is given to the church by the Father and the Son. So in other words, today we are, again, in ecumenical dialogue with the East, we're trying to, sort this out. Even the Catholic Church admits that the Spirit's procession in the first sense is from the Father alone, in the second sense from the Father and the Son. But the answer to your question, Devin, is yes. Augustine did teach that both kinds of procession would apply the filioque. So,
and didn't Cyprian as well?
That seems a little early for me. I want to say that anything before Ambrose is not true.
I meant to say
okay.
Ambrose. Yeah.
I don't know. I think that would be debatable. I'd have to go back and read Ambrose. I want to say that Ambrose was more cautious than that, and Augustine took it farther. But I would have to go back and check.
And didn't Augustine say that even with the hypostatic procession of the Son, didn't he say that the Father is the true monarchy of the Trinity?
Sure, the Father is primary, right, making the Son kind of sort of the agent of procession. I mean, again, that's debatable, but the point that's not debatable is there is a hierarchy within the Trinity, and we do have to sort of maintain the monarchy of the Father, or we run into problems.
Yes.
And that's something that East and West should be able to agree on.
Right, and I think that's a misconception. I think Easterners think that we don't believe in the monarchy of the Father, but if you read our catechism, it clearly says that the Father is the font of divinity.
Oh, absolutely. But it was only pretty recently that I think the Pontifical Council for the Promotion of Christian Unity put an article out there sort of clarifying this. So, I mean, check out my video on the filioque and go into a little bit more depth. But yeah.
Okay, what you got? Can you click where it says new comments? See if we got anything. Got anything there?
I'm such a Luddite. Okay. What do we got here? We got Arians believe in a Christology of ascent. That is correct. But Ehrman, inspired by it, proposes an exaltation Christology. Is this a case of recycling? Okay, so I don't want to, say anything bad about Bart Ehrman. I have written something that he edited, and he He liked it. So thank you, Bart Ehrman. But I worry about some contemporary theologians who are just recycling Arianism in a new, and wrapping it in a new package, and so I think we have to. I think we have to be firm on the Christology of descent. That is, that Philippians 2, he was in the form of God. That means that the Logos starts out divine and becomes human, not the other way around. And if you propose that Jesus, the Word, the Logos, sort of starts out human and becomes exalted, or whatever language you want to use, you've got it backwards, right? We have to stand firm on the Christology of descent, because otherwise John 1 and Philippians 2 become meaningless, right?
Right.
So that's what I'll say.
I mean, and it's almost like the exaltation, it does get affirmed, but what is affirmed has always already been true of the Son.
Well, and this is exactly the point of Philippians 2. Of course he is exalted, but he's exalted to the place he had already held.
That's right.
Which is that place of equality with God that he was willing not to cling to in order for him to be emptied and experience the human condition. Philippians 2, folks, is one of the most important Christological passages in the whole Bible. And by the way, if you have one of those Bibles that translates the kenosis, Philippians 2, as he became nothing, or he made himself nothing, get rid of that Bible and get yourself a new Bible, because that's one of those bad translations. Because he did not make himself nothing, he made himself human. And so he emptied himself. And this is the thing, he has to be divine, because only a divine being has the power to give up his access to these divine attributes in order to be human, right? He self-limits in a way that only an omnipotent being can do.
And is that how you would respond to somebody who says, well, what about when Scripture says the Son knoweth not the hour, only the Father? So what's up with that? This has been on our... We talked about this a little bit before.
That's right. The reason why Jesus doesn't know things is because in the incarnation, which Paul describes as an emptying. Now, he doesn't empty himself of divinity. He doesn't become any less divine. He retains full divinity. But he does kind of set aside the prerogative to access certain divine attributes, because you can't be truly human if you're omnipresent.
Yeah.
You can't experience the human condition if you're omnipotent. So he sets these things aside voluntarily and temporarily in order to truly experience human life. And so, I would say he really doesn't know the day or the hour, because he has previously set aside his ability to know all that stuff so that he can really understand what it's like to be human. It's a bit of a paradox, because it's like, can God make a rock so big that even he himself can't lift it? Well, yeah, but then if he wants to lift it later, he will, So I mean, it's a bit of a paradox, but this is not just, he's not just pretending not to know. I mean, I think he truly doesn't know, but only because he had previously chosen not to know, right?
Yeah, so that's an act of his divine power. So he self-limits. It's not that he by nature doesn't know, it's that he's chosen to limit himself to experience that. And that's in the same way why he could cry out on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, because he's voluntarily chosen to humble himself into the state of human life, to be in solidarity with us, and to truly experience what it's like to be us. So, yeah.
Well, wonderful, guys. I want to thank you for all the people who submitted questions that we read beforehand, and all the people who participated live. Thank you. God bless you, and stay safe. God bless you, your families and friends. And I, again, want to extend my thanks. One last cheers.
Yeah,
Jim.
salute.
This has been an absolute joy and something I can kick off my bucket list. So this has been absolutely wonderful. And with that, we will go ahead and close the broadcast. So I'm just going to reach over, a little bit awkward because of the distance, so you'll have to excuse me. But God bless, guys. Stay safe, and God's grace and peace be with you.